Well, the ACC could hang around, the ACC could not, but who needs it the most to stick around in the long run?
You are Locked On College Football, your daily podcast on all things college football. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome, everybody, to another episode of Locked On College Football. I'm your host, Spencer McLaughlin. Thank you so much for making this your first listen or your first view every day. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day, and your number one source to stay up to date with the biggest stories in the greatest sport on planet Earth. Realignment, coaching, carousel, the portal. We've always got you covered. We'll check in on the Houston Cougars, the Big 12 Houston Cougars, and their new head coach. And is anyone going to slow down Georgia from getting to at least 11 wins? I don't think so, and we'll talk about that later in the show. But the ACC has got two paths that it can go down here. Three, I suppose. Number one, Florida State and Clemson leave. Everybody else remains. You continue to exist as a league. Path number two, Florida State and Clemson leave. Everybody else tries to leave as well. They're willing to pay the exit fees and they disperse, and the ACC just kind of goes by the way of the Pac-12. Or option three, somehow they win the lawsuit. This is the least likely one in my opinion, but I'm not a lawyer. And Florida State and Clemson are required to stay, and the ACC bound by the grant of rights. We'll probably know all that as the year goes on. But I think that assuming Florida State and Clemson leave, that kind of leaves teams in what I see as three different tiers of teams who need the ACC to stick around because they won't get picked up by another major conference, which would just be the Big 10, SEC, and the Big 12 at that time. There are three teams I think who would want that to happen, don't need, but definitely want it. And there are teams that would prefer, but could probably have options either way. So the three teams that need the ACC to stick around in the long run the most are Wake Forest, Syracuse, and Boston College. I don't think that their athletic departments, market, school, tradition, anything like that has got mass appeal to the point where they would ever get a Power 2 invite. I think the ACC is as good as it gets. If the Big 12 were to come hunting for ACC schools upon a departure by Florida State and Clemson, for instance, Pitt and Louisville feel like the schools they would go after first. If they were to go after four, you could get into some other discussions, but that's where I think the ACC group, the group that wants the ACC to stick around doesn't necessarily feel like they would get left behind. They've got a chance of finding a home should realignment come to pass in a harsh way out east, but not necessarily in as dire of a spot, but also preferring the league stick together. I think that's Georgia Tech, Virginia, and Virginia Tech. I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that those sorts of schools could find a home. I think Virginia Tech feels a little bit, and maybe Georgia Tech as well. Georgia Tech could maybe find a way in the Big Ten. I talked about them before. They're an AAU. They're a big research institution. They feel kind of Big Ten-ish, and every conference needs teams to lose some football games, and maybe that's what they would view Georgia Tech as. Though, as we talked about, Brent Key, Don't sleep on the Yellow Jackets making more noise than you think. They went 7-6 last year, just so we're all clear. But Georgia Tech and then Virginia and Virginia Tech, I think, are schools that could draw power invites from either the Big 10 or probably the Big 12. And then the schools that would prefer the ACC to stick around, maybe because of convenience, they haven't raised a lot of noise, that's NC State and Duke. And it's not a coincidence that those schools are in the same camp because they both feel, for different reasons, tied to North Carolina, who I talked about earlier this week on the show with Isaac Shade of Locked On Tar Heels. Go check out that show if you missed it. Isaac had some great stuff. And what he essentially said is that, look, North Carolina would want to leave. They feel more like a Big Ten school. Would they be going there on their own? Probably not. Because if Florida State and Clemson left, would North Carolina go with Miami? Or would North Carolina stick with Duke? Feels like North Carolina and Duke are forever tied at the hip. They're bitter rivals. And you think North Carolina, you think Duke, largely because of basketball, but it's true in football as well. And I think the tie between those universities is very strong. And by the way, the same argument can be made on the NC State side of things. Well, there's a tie between, North Carolina and NC State because they've, got ties in the legal department or with, the state legislature and whatnot. I'd go to what happened out west and say, there is a possibility that Duke is actually the one that goes with them, even though, as I understand it, the obligations for the University of North Carolina to NC State are stronger than to that of Duke. But, North Carolina and Duke are the bigger rivalry. NC State and North Carolina obviously exist in the same state, but Oregon once upon a time took Washington with them to the Big Ten, their biggest rival, and left behind Oregon State, their second biggest rival. So that to me is a scenario that can come to pass. And so for NC State and Duke, look, they might want the ACC to stick together for all the reasons that a lot of us, myself included, don't care to see conferences just completely blown up. Because you've got tradition, you've got convenience, you've got cost as well. I mean, the cost of going into the Big 12 is, depending on how much media rights payment you're actually able to get, can actually be an expense rather than a boon to your athletic department financially, because you now have to pay a lot more in travel for not just football, but for all the other schools too. So I think that those are kind of the three tiers of teams. Now you may be saying, well, what about Miami? I've established this on the show before. Miami should want to get out. They should feel, don't know if they will. There's no guarantee. Miami hasn't made any noise. Have you noticed that Miami's been quiet? This is where Brian Windhorst comes to my mind. Put the fingers out. Why are they quiet? You've got a lawsuit from Florida State. You've got a lawsuit from Clemson. Where's Miami? Miami's got to be the next biggest brand in the ACC football-wise, right? And if you're trying to build the best mega super conferences available in football, how, if you're Miami, are you not expecting to get to that level? I think Miami is in wait and see mode is the answer. Why have they been quiet? Because I think they are looking for Florida State and Clemson to kind of get their hands dirty, do all the dirty work and figure out, hey, can we even do this? Can we just up and leave the ACC? Is that possible? And if so, what does it cost? Well, maybe they don't want to put in the legal hours just yet. They just want to understand, well, what's the number for the ACC? All right, let's talk to some donors and, figure out other ways to find the money or take out a loan or do whatever we need to do to get out of the conference. But would Miami be tied at the hip with North Carolina? Or would North Carolina be tied at the hip with Duke? Or would they be more affiliated with NC State? Would all four of them move together? If Florida State and Clemson go SEC, would those four schools line up to go Big Ten? Miami, North Carolina State, and Duke? Would the Big Ten have an appetite for that? These are questions that we can't answer right now, but certainly are worth thinking about, because this is the next big realignment move, and there are going to be more in the future. I've talked at length on the show before about the possibility of a Pac-12 rebuild. It is very well within the works, and I think this is another reason that we're not seeing movement on the Pac-12 front, because at some point you got to have these conversations. Remember, USC, UCLA, they announced they were leaving the Pac-12 back in 2022. That was July 2022. They haven't actually officially joined the conference yet. It's July 1st, 2024. So if you're trying to organize a conference realignment move, you got to make stuff happen. Now, moves have been made from one conference to another on shorter notice, but at some point, you got to get the ball rolling. And so that's what I think they're waiting for, is if the ACC implodes and you had Wake, Syracuse, and Boston College, for instance, getting left behind, or Virginia Tech hanging out there, if I'm the Pac-12, I'd pick up the phone, make a phone call, see what you can do. What can Willie Fritz do in Houston? Well, we'll talk about that in the Big 12 Cougars. First, this episode of Locked On College Football is brought to you by our friends at Amazon Fire TV, your destination for sports. From live games to highlights to in-depth analysis, Fire TV offers amazing viewing experiences with smart TVs, as well as the Fire TV stick that you can plug into your existing TV that provides access to millions of movies and TV episodes, as well as free and live TV. Whether it's opening weekend for baseball or the college basketball tournament, you're going to want to have a Fire TV. Fire TV recently created Fire TV channels to deliver a constant supply of the latest videos from your favorite sports brands, all for free. That includes all of us here at Locked On and most of the big pro leagues and college conferences as well. Whether it's March Madness, NBA, Major League Baseball, and lots more, it's a great way to stay up to date with sports. Not to mention great news, entertainment, gaming, and travel. If you haven't checked out Fire TV channels, you should. To learn more, visit www.amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. That's amazon.com/LockedOnFireTV. Houston year 2 in the new look Big 12. What are the Cougars going to pull off? Let's talk about that with Parker Ainsworth. He is at Ainsworth512 on X, formerly known as Twitter, host of Locked On Cougars here at the network. Parker, Willie Fritz comes into the fold, comes over from Tulane where he had a lot of success. It was not a great first year in the Big 12 for Houston. FanDuel is not particularly high on the Cougars. Let's talk about the new coach, though, Willie Fritz. How is he being received down there in Houston?
Very well. Energy is up. It is play through the echo of the whistle, and it's on like coaches' t-shirts as they're walking around. Effort and energy are big demands. It's not quite as, I know people don't think of Dana Holgersen as a cerebral kind of guy, maybe, but there's a lot more focus on the effort than just like, being highfalutin in your offense. People are really, the players themselves are speaking very highly of the changes, right? They're not necessarily like talking bad about the previous institution, but the changes and the energy and upbeat tempo, a lot of attention to detail, no music at practice, that kind of stuff. I mean, just a very different vibe across the board. I had one guy, I'm not going to throw his name out there because I don't want to like get him in trouble, but that played on the team last year, is looking to get drafted. Maybe we'll see if he does or not this spring. And he was like, man, I kind of wish I had another year. He was like just talking to guys like he's that enthusiastic about it. So I think those are all good signs. Obviously, I'm not practicing every day. I'm not living it, but I think those are all good signs.
Yeah, so Willie Fritz had a great run at Tulane, double-digit wins each of the last couple of years, the Cotton Bowl victory over USC a couple of seasons ago. This is, and I feel obliged, as always here at Locked On College Football, to remind you of where everyone is in terms of their conference affiliation. It can be confusing. This is a Big 12 Houston Cougars. This is a Big 12 Houston Cougars team. Without Texas and Oklahoma, I think the league gets lighter. It is certainly more manageable than the Big 10 or the SEC, but I think has greater depth than, say, the ACC. Where do you see Houston fitting into the mix long-term with Willie Fritz at the helm? Where can they get to?
The big thing for Houston is keeping kids home, because everyone in the Big 12 is recruiting the city of Houston, right? And so I think in the long term, you're looking at a program that has a lot of tools for success right there in the backyard. Obviously SEC schools are abundant in the area. You got A&M, Texas, LSU, and Oklahoma, all relatively short drives. But Houston itself being a Power 5 program in the city, keeping kids that are, from Klein Kane or from Shadow Creek, or different like big time programs, obviously North Shore being the biggest in the area, I think projects this program being a big time program. And I think that's frankly why they kind of gave Dana the boot. His 2024 recruiting class at the time was just 8 commits in the entire high school class. And he had kind of out loud said on a radio show that, they were just kind of going to let it be that and just kind of keep moving on to the next thing. And I don't think administration took too kindly to the idea of like, hey, all of the resources for one of the greatest cities in all of high school football are right in your backyard. You can't be done, right? And so I take that to mean that I think that the expectation is that it might not be in year 1 or 2 of Willie Fritz, but that this thing is going to get in the right direction, because if they were okay with status quo, bottom third of the conference, they would have just kept the old guy, right? I mean, he had a big buyout and everything.
So as Houston goes into their second year in the Big 12, but their first with Willie Fritz at the helm, in spring football, I presume, has gotten underway down there in Houston. What are kind of the big storylines right now coming out of the Cougars football program?
Big deal is going to be Willie Fritz is a defensive guy. He brings in Kevin Barbay, who was recently stopped at Mississippi State. But what is the offense going to look like with year 2 of Donovan Smith as a full-time starter? Frank, there's some question. Is he going to be a full-time starter? And what does that look like for Houston taking the snaps? Donovan Smith is 6'5", 245, has shown some arm talent at different points, had some very strong games. When he was at Texas Tech before he transferred to Houston, he was kind of a dual threat running over linebackers kind of sized guy. And At Houston, they didn't use much in those kind of situations. And there's kind of some assumption that Willie Fritz and the tough-nosed kind of guy he is may bring some of that back, right? And frankly, if they don't, they also went and got a transfer quarterback named Zion Chris from Louisiana. I always want to say Louisiana Lafayette, by the way. It's Louisiana now, though. He is like your electric 4.4 speed type of quarterback. And so he's maybe a younger guy, more of a project in his arm and those kinds of things. But I think there's a chance you see both guys on the field, and how do they look next fall? I think that's the big question for fans is, all right, we think of Houston as Greg Ward, Case Keenum, these electric offenses. What is that going to look like in the Big 12 next fall?
So as the Cougars look at their schedule, the win totals I mentioned earlier, not very high, according to our friends at FanDuel. It's sitting at 4.5. Is there anything that you would see this spring that would make you think, hey, this could be a bowl team in 2024? What are those sorts of big markers? What are the big priorities for Houston?
Well, I will say, and I know I just talked about quarterback, so maybe this sounds somewhat hypocritical, that when you saw Fritz have success at Tulane, they ran the football. When you've seen Fritz have success at his stops, whether it's Blinn Junior College, Sam Houston State, they had a pretty historic run there for a second. Wherever he's been, they've been able to run the football pretty well. They had a top-end freshman running back, top-end high school recruit that was freshman running back last year in Parker Jenkins. They're also bringing in a handful of transfers, kind of get some thunder and lightning looks along there as well. I think if Houston can play a game control type of run the clock, a lot of counter, keep the ball on the ground, and just keep it away from the defense, I could see this team sneaking out wins that we don't think like the national audience maybe doesn't think they should, right? You could see the same way that no one thought that Tajay Spears was going to beat USC, right? Like those kinds of wins I don't think are super far-fetched for a Willie Fritz coach program, the kind of culture he puts into the program. If it's year one, that would be nice, obviously. But I think there's teams in the Big 12 that are ripe for that right now.
What are your expectations for the Cougars this fall? I think there's still, kind of an adapting and adjusting for transfer portal kids and recruits to get accustomed to the idea that, oh yeah, right, Houston is a Big 12 program and they should be able to, draw this sort of recruit, or whether it's building up their NIL collective or what have you. What are your expectations year one? What is success for Houston this year?
So when I look at their schedule, I think that the key is there's a couple of like non-conference games, your UNLVs, your Rices, that you just got to go win, right? You got to take care of those. They lost to Rice last year. Right? I mean, that's improvement in and of itself. And then there are other teams on your schedule that, whether it's last year, it was Baylor and West Virginia, teams kind of at the bottom end of the Big 12 that like there's no reason you can't beat, right? That like, yes, they've had Big 12 resources for a while now, but at the end of the day, truthfully, they've lost to group of 5 teams in the past. There's no reason you can't get out there and compete with them. I say that to say that you very quickly add up to, 4 or 5 wins that you feel like you maybe should have had. Last year, I thought they should have been bowl eligible, honestly, and they ended up going 4-8, right? And so I don't think that's an unreasonable expectation to think like this team could get to a 5-win thing. 6 in a bowl game is great. You've covered college football every day. I don't need to tell you and your audience, but getting a bowl game in an extra month or 6 weeks of practice is like an unbelievable benefit for the next year's program, right? Like,
especially when you've got a first-year head coach that's trying to build things kind of from the ground up, because Houston football has fallen down from what it's capable of being.
Exactly. And so you think like that's an extra 6 weeks of intentional practice, whether or not you have seniors opt out or whatever, for the program's longevity. I think that's a big, big thing. They do play Oklahoma. I think that's going to be nice for people's feel good if they were to pull that one off. They beat Oklahoma once upon a time, right? Kind of an underdog story a few years back. I just feel like next year's team might still be in a rebuilding mode, not quite there. That's technically a non-conference game, which is weird for Houston to be wearing a Big 12 patch, but Oklahoma to be a non-conference game.
That is a non-conference game. It's as classic an SEC Big 12 matchup as I remember. as a young lad growing up with college football. I remember it very well, Parker. Do you not recall the classic showdowns of Cougars and Sooners?
Well, and, Oklahoma is notably south and east of what? Nebraska? I don't know. No, I think when you factor in, like, Cincinnati is a program a lot like yourself, like getting acquainted to the Big 12. Why can't you go beat that team? BYU as a program has had some really high highs, but they're also new to the Big 12. And so, like, those are programs that go up and down. Like,
for those on podcasts, I am just going up and down like a roller coaster. That's BYU. BYU's gone up, up, up. They've gone down, down, down. They were the 2021 Pac-12 South champions, and well, then there was last year too. That also is the thing that happened.
So you've got those two games, Rice, UNLV. Those are all games I think you can go out and get. And so I'm not afraid to say they should get up around the 5-win mark. And like I said, 6 is a great goal because of what it means long term.
Parker Ainsworth, Locked On Houston Cougars. Appreciate you keeping us up to date with all things down there in the city of Houston.
Thanks for having on, Spitzer.
What can stop Georgia from making the college football playoff? I don't know. You tell me. Before we get to the Bulldogs, let's get to our friends at FanDuel. The sports calendar is loaded, and FanDuel's making it even more exciting to get in on the action because right now, new customers get $200 in bonus bets with any winning $5 bet. That's $200 you can use to bet on the tournament, Major League Baseball, the NBA, NHL, and so much more. If you want to get your college football gambling fix on? FanDuel's the place to get it. Win totals, conference championship, make the playoff, miss the playoff, everything you could possibly want. Even individual game bets are over there at FanDuel. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make your first bet a big win. Maybe you think Georgia's going 12-0. If you do, we're going to talk about them in just a second. You can bet them over at FanDuel. Their win total is very high. It's very, very high. Visit FanDuel.com/lockedon. Make your first bet a big win. FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook and our official sportsbook here at the Locked On Network. Ask yourself this question. Why is Georgia over 10.5 wins not a great bet? Answer, you don't have one. I think it is a great bet because I go through Georgia's schedule and I don't know who's stopping them here. Do we all remember? Let's, Joker style, wind the clocks back a year. Nick Saban's still the coach at Alabama, and Kirby Smart and Georgia have just won back-to-back national championships, and they go through the regular season at, wait for it, 12-0. They get to the SEC title game, they fall in a competitive battle with the Crimson Tide to Nick Saban. Saban isn't there anymore, so Georgia faced one obstacle last year. Now, not every game was really easy, right? Auburn gave him a little bit of a scare and whatnot. But I just think about Georgia and where they're at as a program, where they're at going into this year, and just keep asking myself, who is going to stop these guys? Because they open with Clemson on August 31st. One of the games of the year. 2 of Georgia's first 4 games in 2024 are going to be among the biggest, most hyped games in all of college football. They occur week 1 there, August 31st against Clemson. That's at Mercedes-Benz Stadium in Atlanta of what we're going to call a neutral site game. Call it what you will. And then in week 5, they're off a bye playing at Alabama in Tuscaloosa, where Kalen DeBoer is now the head coach. Sandwich in between, they've got Tennessee Tech. I think they'll win that one. And then they go at Kentucky. So kind of a tough start there for Georgia. They are playing just one game in their home stadium in their first 4 games. What does that mean? Well, it's going to be a little bit loaded with the home schedule in the back half, including each of their final 3 games of the regular season. Now, Georgia's schedule is one of the toughest in the SEC, but my confidence in Georgia seems to just be growing by the day because I've been thinking about this for a while now and figured today was as good as any to, talk about it here on the show. They're going to be favored in that game at Alabama. I don't know by how much, but I think they're going to be favored. In fact, FanDuel might even have that game. We'll check on that in a moment. They come back home. They host Auburn. They host Mississippi State. I'm not picking an upset in either of those particular spots. Why? Because I just don't see Georgia losing at home. By the way, week 1 in that game against Clemson, it's going to be a big game. Big opportunity for Dabo Swinney right there. What do you think is the betting line in that game? Georgia at Alabama, just for reference, Georgia at Alabama is Georgia minus 3.5. Yeah, it's Georgia minus 12.5 against Clemson. Yikes. I've seen bigger statistical upsets happen against what Vegas thinks the betting line should be, but that's a big old number for the Georgia Bulldogs. So after they take on Auburn and Mississippi State, they go at Texas, and then they play Florida. So that's not an easy stretch. That's not a gimme. By the way, they've got a bye sandwiched in between Texas and Florida. Then they go at Ole Miss, where they will also be a slight underdog, or sorry, a smaller favorite than they will be at in other games, which really feels sometimes like you're an underdog if you're Georgia. Then they host Tennessee. They host UMass. We got to get rid of those late season cupcakes, man. And then they host Georgia Tech. That's win, and win for me there to end the year. I think they're going to start with at least 3 wins, possibly 4. That game is going to tell us a lot. That game against Alabama, if Georgia goes in favored by 3.5 points and the line stays there, and they win that game, let's say, for instance, by 10 to 13 points, and they're kind of comfortably ahead, that Alabama roster that certainly took some losses early in the offseason has rebounded in a big way with Kalen DeBoer and company and the way they've utilized the transfer portal. That's going to be one of the 10 best rosters in college football. I don't think Bama's top 5. I think they're probably in the 6 to 10 range. But you give a top 6 to 10 roster to Kalen DeBoer, boy, that game might just come down to quarterback play. Now, I like Georgia's more than Alabama's because I think Carson Beck is a bona fide stud. This is a Carson Beck fan show. I think that guy is absolutely awesome behind center. One of the best in the country, is one of the betting favorites to win the Heisman Trophy, and he absolutely should be. I think you can make the case the hardest game on this Georgia schedule is at Texas on October 19th, because Texas has got what's my rule on the show? For my everydayers out there, one of my consistent themes, of which I have many, presidents vote on realignment, not athletic directors and such, but I am going to almost always lean towards a team who returns the same coach, the same quarterback, and the same offensive coordinator. Georgia and Texas have these things in common. Do you realize that? Steve Sarkisian is the offensive coordinator. And then Mike Bobo is back for Georgia as the offensive coordinator down there in Athens. So again, coach, offensive coordinator, quarterback, all returning. I can make the case those are the 2 best teams in the SEC, Georgia and Texas. A classic SEC pair of teams if I've ever seen one. But I just go through this schedule and think, okay, in all likelihood, Georgia's going to be favored in every single game that they will play. Maybe they're an underdog at Texas. Vegas has got them right now. FanDuel's got them as a 1.5-point favorite at Texas. So that's pretty slight. That's pretty close to a pick'em. And no one wins every game in which they're favored. I don't expect, because of the tough nature of the schedule, at Texas, at Ole Miss, and at Alabama, you're probably losing at least one of those games. But I just continue to think about how good Kirby Smart is and how good Georgia's roster is and where this program was a year ago. I think somehow it kind of feels like Georgia is not being forgotten, but not being treated in the same way that they would had that game against Alabama gone differently. Because last year, Georgia played in a bowl game that many people disregarded and didn't watch because they blasted Florida State into oblivion. I think what happened in that game is actually illegal in 48 states. So I think for the Bulldogs, they come into this year still feeling supremely confident. They've still got a 13-win season under their belt from last year. They've still got 2 national championships in the last 3 seasons. They've still got a Heisman caliber quarterback and one of the 3 or 4 best rosters in all college football, maybe the best roster in all of college football. Certainly you can look at, how are you going to replace weapons like Lab McConkey or Brock Bowers, but I don't think that's going to be a major problem. And I don't worry about it at a place like Georgia when you've got a quarterback like Carson Beck. That's far more important. Quarterback makes receivers far more often than receivers make a quarterback, right? Sometimes you have that, right? Sometimes you've got Tyreek Hill and Tua Tagovailoa. Tua is aided tremendously by having Jalen Waddle and Tyreek Hill. And it turns out Mac Jones was also aided by having guys like Devontae Smith in college, and I believe Jaden Waddle was on that receiving core. So those are really tough road games. At Texas, at Alabama, at Ole Miss. I think they lose. I don't see how they lose two. I really don't. I am that confident in this Georgia team. I just think that they are so well set up to have another high-level, high-volume win season. I think over 10.5 is indeed the side with the Bulldogs, and I just don't know who's slowing them down from getting to the playoff. Do you know what Georgia is to make the playoff right now? I'm gonna give you a second to guess what Georgia is to make the playoff. I'll give you a hint. They're the shortest odds of anybody in the country. Yeah, that's right. -500. -500. For those not familiar with what that means, allow me to explain. If you had a bet of around -110, that would be pretty close to what Vegas sees as a 50-50 proposition. Georgia's -500 to make the playoff. You only have to win 10 games in the SEC or the Big Ten to make the college football playoff in all likelihood. 11 assuredly gets you in. 10 most likely gets you in, but not guaranteed. And if you win 12, well, yeah, that's an automatic, of course. And I just don't see how you're going to have, like, there are some great teams in the SEC. I've talked about them here. I don't see how they are going to all be able to get a good enough crack at Georgia to keep them out of the playoff. I think Georgia's a lock to make it. -500 is where they should be. And I think they're locked to go over 10.5 wins because I think that roster, that coach, that quarterback, remember, they were just one game short of having a chance to play for a national championship. So they've got a little chip on their shoulder. They've got a revenge tour element to them. And that is a dangerous football team. And I don't think anybody in the SEC can stop them from reaching the playoff. Appreciate everyone listening. I will see you next time. And until then, hope you have a wonderful rest of your day.